relationship with Herbert Marcuse, for whom it is a living honor to have been a student of. I'm so jealous. So let's begin talking about the Eros effect first. Take it in any way you want. You can begin elaborating on the construct first, or you can begin describing these international social movements of which you're really becoming an important expert.
Well, I don't know about being an expert, but I have met many different groups and listened and learned from the wisdom of very ordinary people facing very difficult situations and the kinds of attempts that they make to create solidarity in the midst of division. And you know, Eros the concept of the Eros effect should begin with Marcuse. Herbert Marcuse wrote many books. The best of his books was called Eros and Civilization. It was an attempt to synthesize the writings of two very misunderstood thinkers, Sigmund Freud and Karl Marx, who were not very commonly thought of as having much to do with each other. But Marcuse showed that, in fact, what these thinkers were able to do was conceptualize the basis for a liberated society based on an economic fundamental restructuring in which human need was primary, and based on a psychological restructuring in which eros, love, connection between people, was primary. Not division, not profit, not hierarchy. The basis of Marcuse's understanding of eros differs greatly from how eros is commonly understood. We spoke a moment ago about democracy, how democracy is greatly misunderstood in terms of what it actually means. Eros is often in the society of commodification, of capitalist relations, of consumerism, understood purely as sex. In fact, that's how it's most often used. And yet that does a great injustice to
and
Eros.
Monogamous sex at that.
And perhaps not even.
Not even that. As it applies to two individuals only. In your hands, you expand the construct.
Well, the concept, Martin Luther King spoke about another Greek word, agape.
Correct.
Agape as love of one for another. Eros is more all-embracing because it brings not only the solidarity of people into question, but the hearts of people, the souls of people, if you will. But they're both very related in that they're not sexual forms of solidarity, of connection between people, but they are even more vital forms to the human condition. You speak in your work about the human heart and how the human heart is the center of thinking, as the ancient Egyptians thought and believed. I think if we want to critique modern Western civilization, we can begin with fundamentals. And fundamentally speaking, some people have spoken of the mind-body split.
That's right.
The fact that so-called rationality, the idea that all mathematical and relationships should be key to our understanding, i.e. the profit motive.
That's right.
As opposed to locating eros, the heart, as being at the center of how society is organized. And as you've so eloquently written about it, this means that the brain might not be the place where true thinking is accomplished. It might actually be in the heart, where real thinking, meaningful thinking occurs. This is the basis for the Eros effect. And in social movements, it was a very interesting development because with Marcuse's help, I spent many years investigating what had happened in the world in the 1960s. I remember as a younger graduate student, I looked at what happened in France in May 1968 when a general strike of workers, 9 or 10 million workers, broke out in response to student protests. And the country was almost brought to a complete standstill and government overthrown. in May 1968, and I was very happy to finish that, and then I worked on the U.S. in May to August 70, and uncovered that there had been a very similar situation in the U.S. that nobody even really knew about, talked about. And I said, "Oh, Herbert, I've done it. I've got my work finished." And he looked at me and he said, in his characteristic way, "You're only going to talk about 2 countries?"
That's right.
And I thought, what are you talking about? This was, I mean, I had to, learn to read French, and I learned this and that, and my goodness. And he said, "But it's so interesting what the effect of these countries were throughout the world, the U.S. movement, the French movement." And I said, "Oh, well, that's very interesting. Maybe what I should do is go to study in Spain." And he said, "Why on earth would you go to study in Spain?" I said, "Well, I speak Spanish."
That's right.
And it's a very interesting place.
He particularly told him he wanted to go to Madrid.
To Madrid.
And he said,
and I
"You're
had
going
it all
to be
set
bored,"
up,
he
actually.
told you.
And he said, "George, you're going to be bored if you go to
That's
Madrid."
right.
And I said, "Herbert,
Why not Germany?
where should I go?" He said,
Germany.
"Berlin, of course."
Yes.
Where he was, born, and he was a Berliner.
That's
and I said, "But Herbert, I don't know the first thing about the German movement." He said, "Well, then we need to start now."
That's right.
And he said, "Do you know what the APO is, the extra-parliamentary opposition?" I said, "Not exactly." And we began. And I went to Berlin, and then was able to connect with very vibrant social movements there.
Right.
Squatters, feminists, people opposing nuclear power, people opposing Nazism and racism. Was a wonderful experience, and wrote the book, The Subversion of Politics, based on that later. But at that time, I was able to travel extensively in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, in Western Europe, Northern Europe, and to gauge the impact of the 1968 movement in many countries. So when I came back to San Diego, I traveled in Mexico and assembled all of my research materials, and was sitting in my small apartment one day and making a chronology of the various movements of 1968, and I realized, my goodness, in relationship to what happened in Vietnam in January, the German students in Berlin in February had a huge conference and agreed to protest the war more resolutely. And many of the students there were from Paris, and they went back to Paris on March 22nd, had a big movement that helped spark the May events, and the May events sparked the movement in Mexico City, which protested the Olympics.
Amazing.
And the Columbia movement had an effect over here on France, and the Italian movement was inspired by France. The Spaniards attempted a general strike of their own. Even in Ghana, there was a general strike by students that led to a strike by workers after May 68. So I started saying, oh my goodness, these are all related to each other. These solidarity bonds were more important than different economic structures. After all, what do Vietnam and Germany have in common? West Germany at that time, in terms of economic structures, very little. Different cultures. I don't like the term race, different races. What are, different governments? What did these movements have in common? Their solidarity with each other. So the idea that it was eros that was motivating these, solidarity, love for each other. Don't forget, at this time, poll after poll of American college students showed that Ho Chi Minh, the president of Vietnam, was more popular than Richard Nixon, the president of the United States.
Is that right?
That's right. American young people did not buy the idea that an American life was worth more than a Vietnamese life.
Amazing.
In fact, American college students at that time had wonderful connections to the military. The military in Vietnam refused to fight. That's why we don't have a volunteer army.
Uh-huh.
We have a mercenary army now. We have more Blackwell-type employees in Afghanistan than we have troops. Why is that? For many reasons, but in great part because the volunteer army simply refused to fight, because fundamentally